Talk Radio.
Now, Jonathan Davis is an economist and a wealth advisor, and so I wanted to talk to Jonathan, and I'm grateful that he's given me the time on a Friday evening to talk about the customs union and the possibility that Jeremy Corbyn, it is only a possibility, we've had no official word on this, and no one close to him has given me any steer. So it's either that Corbyn is going to execute a U-turn on Monday in a speech, or he isn't. And I want to explore the implications of both. Jonathan Davis, welcome to the show.
Hi, George.
Now, I was saying earlier, you might not have heard me, that to be in the customs union is not the same thing necessarily as being in a customs union, a bespoke, tailored, special arrangement between Britain and the EU. Do you share that view, first of all?
Well, I think legally and technically you're probably accurate. I think in practice, unless we leave the EU full stop, we are therefore still partly in the EU, and that is very problematic for me. It's a bit like being a little bit pregnant. You either are or you aren't. If you are a bit, then the way politicians are, then incrementally they'll take us back in gradually and imperceptibly.
Well, that's my view entirely, even using some of the same words as I did. Great minds think alike, especially if they're both Scottish. We don't have to look in the crystal ball, Jonathan. I've just heard it come out of the jackal's mouth. Tony Blair just said exactly what you and I are saying, that if Britain is to continue to have a close economic relationship with the EU, and he's talking about the customs union, it will have to follow EU rules. And if we follow EU rules, we haven't left the EU, and therefore the 17.5 million who voted to leave the EU will have been betrayed.
And I said the day that Theresa May became leader of the Conservatives and therefore the Prime Minister, I said, I wonder whether or not we're actually going to leave the EU. And she has said repeatedly, Brexit means Brexit. Well, the problem is politicians say a lot of things and then they do the opposite. There's no question, all she's trying to do is save her job. Talk about short-termism in the scheme of things. Talk about not caring about what the country wants. And when I say the country, of course, 48% voted to remain, but the fact is we had the vote. And everyone involved at the time in June 2016 said, we will implement your decision, you're being the British people. Well, we made the decision. All of a sudden, it's Parliament who's got a say in it.
Well, a veto. They've got a veto.
Well, perhaps they do. But Parliament doesn't have a say in it as far as I'm concerned. It shouldn't do, because they all said at the time, we will implement your decision. And the vote was very simple. Do you want to stay in the EU or do you want to leave? There was no, do you want this or do you want that? I see one of the papers saying, we don't even know what the 4 alternatives are. As far as I'm concerned, there is one alternative. There is only one route, and that is entirely to leave any legal relationship with Brussels, with the EU Commission. We become self-determinant. We decide our laws. We don't go with the European Court of Justice. And the idea that we have to be in a or the customs union, we have to be in the single market for this industry and that industry, but maybe not for this industry and that industry. In other words, it's pretty vague. The idea that that is implementing the will of the British people, well, you know, it's as as ridiculous as Chamberlain in 1938 coming back from Munich, having seen Mussolini and Hitler and whoever the French guy was, saying, "I have the paper. There'll be peace in our time." It's
I just watched Darkest Hour. Maybe I'll talk about that later. Truly moving and tremendous movie. And the analogy that you make, some might think a little far-flung, but actually, when you think about it, this is an existential challenge to British democracy. Parliament and democracy will be gravely damaged if the feeling is amongst millions, not the whole 17.4 million, maybe, but amongst millions of British people, that they took an important decision and it was betrayed by politicians.
Absolutely, and we hear time and time again of many of the Remain voters who accept that the vote took place. And then you consider also that every single one of the establishment organisations that said that the UK economy would go to hell in the handcart, if even we voted to leave, never mind we actually left, and have been proved absolutely 100% to have been talking stuff of nonsense. When you add those two things together, you can reasonably estimate that if this vote happened again, it would be 60% to leave and 40% to remain, a resounding vote to leave. That is how I read the British people, the sentiment today.
Well,
even some MPs, many MPs who voted Remain said, well, we had the vote, we need to leave.
Well, I share that view, although I have to live and work in a bubble in central London. I'm going all the time from TV studios to radio studios, filming, film sets, and so on. And it's easy.
Terrible, George.
It's easy. It's hard work, but somebody's got to do it. It's easy to get the false impression that Brexit is no longer wanted by everyone around you. But of course, it's how this plays in Porthcawl, in Preston, in Poulton Le Fylde. These are the places where, in Peterborough, these are the places Labour needs to win and keep if it's going to form an election. I think Jeremy Corbyn will be making a grave strategic political error if he executes a U-turn on Monday to please the metropolitan elite and their media and their mandarins. What do you think?
Well, this is now party politics. I think that Corbyn, MacDonald, Abbott, I think they make mistake after mistake. In any case, on this particular point, it seems to me no doubt that on the one hand you've got the Tory cabinet, which is split down the middle, and that's why we've had a fudge for a year and a half. On the other hand, although Corbyn and McDonnell apparently say we're going to Brexit, you've got the likes of Thornbury and Abbott who say, no, we can't do that and all the rest of it. So they both seem to be split down the middle. I think the followers of Momentum and Corbyn and McDonnell, actually, I think they'll just do whatever is the opposite to what the government says they want to do. Whether or not it's right, I think they'll just play party politics and do the opposite.
Lastly, I made the point earlier that if we are in the customs union, it's not just that we're not able to make tailored trading arrangements with all the other countries in the world, though that is serious enough. It is that the decisions of the EU on all matters of trade policy will apply to us. So that, for example, and I gave as an example the steel industry. which was virtually destroyed by the dumping of cheap Chinese steel on the British market. We would not be permitted to halt the dumping of cheap Chinese steel unless the European Union did it also and first. Now, to what extent are you therefore not in the EU, if that's the case? To what extent are you an independent sovereign country again?
Yeah, well, as I say, you can't be a little bit pregnant. Whenever I think about the customs union, I think about our costs of food. I think about how we could be importing food from African farmers. How many decades have we cried at the sight of starving kids in Africa? And yet, because of EU tax tariffs, African farmers can't really much export into the EU because it costs, no one can buy their stuff because you have to add on such a massive tariff. If we were to leave the EU, if we were to come out of the customs union, we could set our own, maybe, free trade, 0% tariffs, or whatever it is, but certainly it would be a tiny fraction of the tariffs that the EU have set up, shall we say, to keep the French farmers in their Mercedes and Range Rovers. No, well, they don't really buy British Range Rovers.
Well said, Jonathan.
But one final point. One final point, very quickly. The idea that if we leave the EU, that we will no longer be able to buy Mercedes, BMW. I'm telling you, the chief executives of those companies will be banging on the door of Frau Merkel saying, we need the UK. This is what I said in speeches before the referendum, and that's the simple point that's not being got across here. They're still saying it will create economic difficulties if we leave the EU. Stuff of nonsense.
Jonathan Davis, economist and wealth advisor, thank you very much indeed for joining us.